Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Thiel College. On behalf of our faculty and staff, it's our distinct pleasure to host the second annual Haer Family Symposium on campus. It's just great to see both the new and familiar faces as well as some of the new faces for what is anticipated to be a very leading-edge two-day series where Thiel College has had the good fortune and outstanding opportunity to learn from some of our nation's leading authorities in the field of cardiology and behavioral economics. Now, the Haer Family Symposium marks an important milestone in our continuing effort to deliver on the aims of the commitment to academic excellence and relevance and the commitment to superior delivery programs and services. And I'd like to thank our distinguished speakers for inspiring the next generation of science and healthcare leaders among our ranks by bringing his expert knowledge and skill to us today. While the Haer Family Symposium is intended to encourage students, faculty, and staff to pursue innovative research, apply knowledge, and break new grounds in service to humanity, we continue to be inspired by the profound vision and generosity of a special family that not only maintains deep roots here in Pennsylvania, but has been a lifelong friend to Thiel College and its students. We sincerely appreciate Thiel College Board of Trustee member and its distinguished alumni, Fred Haer and his wife Jill, who we proudly call our own for so many reasons. Fred has served the neuroscience community for nearly 40 years, designing and manufacturing microelectrode recording and stimulation technology, serving neuroscientific research and neuroserological operating rooms across a broad range of research and clinical instrumentations. His company entered into a partnership that created the neuroscience major here at Thiel College and recently opened up the Thiel College Study Annex for Science and Medical Arts at Greenville Neuromodulation Services. He established Greenville Neuromodulation in our community and has been the driving force behind the Greenville Neuromodulation Clinic, which is creating a great deal of buzz in healthcare and economic circles in the region and the world. I'd also like to acknowledge the good work and leadership of the Community Medical Ethics Project, which is sponsored by UPMC Horizon, Thiel College, Holy Trinity Lutheran Church, and St. Paul's. Their mission in helping our community make important life decisions about healthcare is a worthy one. Thank you. Here to introduce today's lecturer and guest speaker is our own Dr. Delbert Abi Abdallah, Assistant Professor of Biology at Thiel College.
Good evening, everyone. I would first like to welcome you all to the Haer Family Symposium. We are very excited today to have with us the very esteemed Dr. Sandeep Jauhar. He is a medical doctor, a cardiologist, and an author. We are thankful to the support of the Haer family and are very honored to have Dr. Jauhar speak with us this evening. Dr. Jauhar comes to us from New York City, where he is a practicing cardiologist. In addition to that, however, he is a very esteemed author. He had his beginnings out in California. He has his bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees in physics from University of California, Berkeley. He then went on to earn his medical doctor degree from WashU, or Washington University School of Medicine. After that, he moved to New York City, and he did an internship and a residency at New York's Presbyterian Hospital. He then served a fellowship in cardiology at NYU's Medical Center. That sort of put him straight into the stuff he writes about. And after a very grueling training at the teaching hospital, and during his dealings with patients and our medical system, Dr. Jauhar wrestled with a lot of decisions about getting into medicine and started asking a few hard questions about our modern medical system. That led him to become a prolific writer about issues and challenges facing medical doctors as well as our medical system. Dr. Jauhar has been writing about health and medicine for New York Times for over a decade now, and is a regular contributor to other esteemed publications, such as the New England Journal of Medicine, Slate, New York Magazine, and the LA Times. Dr. Jauhar is the author of 2 bestseller list books. I brought both with me today. Intern, a doctor's initiation, and Doctored, the Disillusionment of an American Physician. And it is also my understanding that he has graciously agreed to sign any copies you have with you in the audience. I'd certainly like mine signed. I can stand here and list his many accomplishments and achievements for you, but you did not come here to listen to me speak. You came here to listen to him. So without any further ado, I present to you Dr. Sandeep Jauhar.
Thank you. Before I came here, I read up a little bit about Thiel College, and I was honestly very impressed by the roster of alumni that this college has produced, and this place seems very special when I read about it, and the reception I received this afternoon just reinforces that impression for me. I just had a wonderful dinner with the president and some of his colleagues, and it's just been great. So I want to thank you for that. I want to start off by thanking Dean Franken for inviting me, the Haer family for sponsoring the symposium, and President Aiken. When Dean Franken and I spoke maybe last week, a couple weeks ago, she said that I really should focus on a talk that's going to speak to the students in the audience. I had just wrote a book called Doctored that came out in August, and so I've been sort of on the speaking circuit and talking about some of the issues in American medicine. I decided after speaking with her that that's really not what I'm going to speak about tonight, because I think the students in the audience are probably struggling with a question that I asked myself a lot when I was growing up and when I was in college, which is, what should I do with my life? And I really appreciate the introduction. And when I was listening to it, I thought, wow, that's pretty amazing. Like all these things that I did, this story just seems so seamless. But the reality is that our life stories are never seamless, that they're always sort of racked with conflict and tension and doubt. And when I look back on my college days, the one question that always was in my mind was, what should I do with my life? And since then, the questions have changed because I made a commitment to my profession, and they've sort of transformed themselves. But when I look back, this question of what I should do with my life was probably the most difficult question that I've ever struggled with. And so if any of you out there are thinking about this and don't know what to do, I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about my own story and sort of the steps I took to resolving this question for myself. So the first part of my talk will really be talking about myself and how I got into medicine. You heard that I did a PhD in physics. So there was a big change for me, a big sort of crisis when I was finishing up graduate school to make a huge shift in my life and move to medicine. Why did I make that shift? I'll talk a little bit about that. That'll sort of be the first part of the talk, and then I'll talk about how I got into writing, because I think that for many of us, and especially today when I see students with so many disparate interests, one profession, one job is usually not enough to sustain you, to nurture you, to help you feel self-actualized. And that was the case for me. I'd always wanted to be a writer, and so I made some changes to try to realize that dream. So I'll talk about that in sort of the second part of the talk. And then I'll talk a little bit about the book, Intern. I'm not going to talk about my most recent book, Doctored, because I think that most of the students will really want to hear more about that early phase in my career. And then I'll read probably one, maybe two short selections from the book. And I think that whole thing will probably take about 35 minutes or so, 40 minutes, and then I'll take some questions. So let me start off by telling you a little bit about myself. So I was born in India, in New Delhi. My father was a plant geneticist, a research scientist, and he moved around a lot. And so the early part of my life was sort of itinerant. We lived in New Delhi, and then we moved to Wales in the UK. We moved back to India. We moved to London, and so it was sort of back and forth because he was, now that I look back on it, he was trying to actualize his own dreams of, what did he want to do with his life, and so he sort of tugged us along. And in the end, we ended up moving to the United States in 1977. I was 8 years old, and we moved to Kentucky for a short period, and then we ended up moving to California. And I grew up in Southern California. I went to high school there, and then ended up going to Berkeley for college. And I remember thinking about this question of what am I going to do with my life? It started really early, probably like when I was, 9 or 10. My parents wanted me to become a doctor. My father actually had wanted to be a doctor, but he couldn't afford a medical education, so he became a research scientist. My mother grew up in a family of physicians, and she always she wanted all three of her children to become doctors. And when I was growing up, she would say, "I want you to become a doctor so that people will stand when you walk into a room." It was that kind of mindset, the sort of high esteem that doctors were held in back in from that generation. And my father was a sort of hardcore scientist. His favorite saying was, "Non-science makes nonsense." And so, so he would always sort of push us to go into science or something hard or hardcore or objective, rational. But when I was growing up, I was really more interested in the subjective, the letters, philosophy, political science, and that was sort of the beginning of this tension, because this is really what I was most interested in, but my parents were telling me to do something totally different. And when I thought about becoming a doctor, it just didn't fill me with a lot of joy. My grandfather was a doctor in New Delhi, and sometimes I would go visit him and see how he would work. And I would think, this is cool. I mean, this is all right, but this isn't really what I want to be doing, because it just didn't seem like medicine had a creative outlet. When you think about it, medical schools train 17,000 or so students, or graduate 17,000 students every year, and perhaps the ideal is to have them all practice the same way, to approach the same problem in the same way, and that's not what I wanted to do. And I even sensed back then that medicine had this sort of cookbook aspect to it that just didn't really interest me. So I struggled. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I went to Berkeley, and I had a lot of interests, like probably most of you have. So I was interested, besides, literature and English, I was interested in the mysteries of the universe. So I ended up studying physics. And I remember telling my father that I wasn't going to be a doctor. I was going to be a research physicist. And I just remember him being kind of disappointed, and because in that culture that I grew up in, this immigrant Indian culture, saying no to a career in medicine and going into physics was like rebellion. You know what I mean? It was not like, because most of the people that I grew up with, they sort of followed in their, what their parents were telling them to do. So I ended up studying physics, and I did undergrad, and then I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do at the end of undergrad, and I thought about a lot of different things, but I didn't think about medicine because it had that sort of cookbook aspect to it that I just wasn't interested in. So I ended up applying to physics graduate schools, but also to law school. And I took the LSAT, I applied, I got in. But in the end, I had this sense that I just didn't want to be a lawyer. So I went to graduate school in physics. And it was interesting. I did some pretty cool research. I worked actually on a very esoteric thing called a quantum dot, which I'm sure none of you know about. I hope not. But quantum dots are these sort of cool little structures with very few electrons that sort of behave like an artificial atom. So I did all sorts of cool research on that, and it got published in like some of the top journals, and I was set. I was going to go into a career as a physics professor. But something was missing, and and I didn't really know what it was. But there was a lot of satisfaction I gleaned from solving a really tough problem on paper, that sort of eureka, aha moment. But when you do a lot of that, every day, it starts to dim that kind of joy. And the thing that I realized that was really missing from my life was interacting with people. I didn't really want to be in the lab all the time. And so I started thinking about what can I do that will allow me to have more of an impact on this world. But I was finishing up my physics PhD, so I figured, okay, I should do like science policy. Maybe I should go to law school and become a patent lawyer or something. I never really thought about medicine. And then a dear friend of mine got sick with lupus, and I was spending a lot of time with her, and this was a devastating illness for her. Totally changed her life, and in an effort to help her, I would take her to support group meetings, and I would call doctors. I went to the library and I sort of researched about lupus, and I sort of brought this, typical graduate student mentality to the problem of lupus. I figured, okay, if I dig deep enough, I'm going to figure out what causes this disease and how I'm going to be able to help my girlfriend. But medicine isn't really like that, I discovered. Most of medicine is really uncharted and very uncertain. And so in the course of researching about her disease, I spent a lot of time with doctors, and I thought, this is so different from what I'm doing in physics. Not only is it uncharted and uncertain, but it's a field that I can really make an impact. And so around that time, my brother is also a doctor, and we work together now. But at the time, he was living in San Diego, about a mile from the beach. He was a resident in internal medicine. He had gone to medical school. And I was having all these doubts about continuing on in physics. And so I visited him. And whenever I would go visit him, I sort of hoped that I would see him like really struggling, as a resident, like tired all the time. So I could at least sort of point to one thing in my life that was like better than his, like at least I got enough sleep. But he always seemed really happy, chipper. His friends seemed pretty cool, and there was just a confluence of things, and I decided that I was going to apply to medical school. And this was a big change because when I decided, I was 24 years old, and the culture I came from, that was sort of like over the hill when it came to like just figuring out your career. You know what I mean? I mean, you don't make a big change when you're 24 years old. I mean, you sort of go on and finish what you're doing and get a job and settle down. And I remember when I told my father that I was going to apply to medical school, he was kind of shocked. And I thought he'd be pretty happy. But he's like, are you sure you really want to do this? My mother's like, can you wake up in the morning? Are you going to be able to be an intern and wake up at 5 in the morning? And I said, I don't know. I have no idea. But I'm going to try. And so I decided to apply to medical school. And I applied everywhere. And I ended up getting into Washington University in St. Louis. So that was sort of the end of that one aspect of my journey, because I got into medical school, I made that decision, but there was always that doubt that, not only, medicine appealed to me in the sense that I was going to be able to help people and interact with people, but there was always that sense of the creative outlet. How was I going to satisfy that aspect of myself? And I found in talking with students that a lot of you struggle with that, like I did, because a profession is designed for sort of a homogeneous person, but we are heterogeneous. We have disparate interests. And I'm finding this more and more as I go into medicine, and I go on in medicine in my career, that a lot of doctors are burning out today because they never fostered that other hidden passion in themselves. They wanted to become doctors, and they succeeded, and they worked really hard, but then a lot of them had this secret desire to act or write or be an architect or whatever. And the great thing about the culture today is that it's so much more open and flexible. And so many of my doctor colleagues today are doing other things. And one thing that I want to impart to you is that if you do end up going into medicine or a health profession in general, there's just a lot of flexibility. It'll allow you to do many different things. Just last month, a student, actually she's a resident at Columbia University, wrote to me, and it turned out that she had been a practicing architect before she went to medical school. And now she wants to apply her architectural background to medicine and design, hospitals that will foster patient care. So there's a lot of stuff that you can do. for me, I had always been interested in writing. And so I figured it was the summer before I started medical school, and I figured, I'm going to, it's sort of a free summer. I'm pretty much done with my PhD, so I'm going to go and do something creative. And I wasn't sure exactly what I was going to do. And I'm a firm believer in serendipity. So I was walking in the physics department one day, and there was a flyer for a journalism fellowship at Time Magazine. And it's called the Mass Media Fellowship. It's not just at Time Magazine. It's a fellowship that places science graduate students and medical students at different media outlets throughout the country. And so I applied, and I just had to write an essay. And about 300 people applied, and they accepted about 15 people. And miraculously, I was one of those 15 people. And they placed me at Time Magazine. So this was like the summer before I started medical school. So I went to Time Magazine, and it was just really an amazing experience, because I had spent all these years doing quantum dots. And now I was in Washington, D.C., at Time Magazine, and the first week I was there, they sent me to the Capitol to get a quote from Senator Bob Dole. And this was like totally nothing I'd ever expected, nothing I'd ever done before. But I just thought it was really cool. I wanted to be there. And so they sent me off to the Capitol building where Senator Dole was giving his, he was on the Senate floor, and I had to get this quote from him on the working poor. And so there were all the, he was the Senate Majority Leader at the time, and so there were all these journalists who were trying to get Dole's attention. And so I didn't know how I was going to break through that group, because there were people from the New York Times and from NBC News, and here I was, like this little Indian kid from who had a PhD in physics, and I didn't really know what I was doing, and so but I a PhD in physics, I applied that brilliance. I thought, okay, well, how am I going to get to Dole? Well, I knew he had a prostate problem. So I figured I should just decamp to the bathroom, because he was going to have to go to the bathroom at some point. So while everyone's like sort of standing there trying to get Dole, they're standing right in front of the entrance to the rotunda, I just go off to the bathroom. I'm like, I'm just going to hang out here. And lo and behold, Dole shows up. And so I say, and then I'm not sure exactly what I said in retrospect. It must have been, I was certain it was complete garbage, because I was so nervous that I was certain that I just stammered out a complete bunch of gibberish. And Dole just sort of like looked at me. And I wasn't in the bathroom, I was outside the bathroom. And then he walked into the bathroom, and that was that. And he didn't talk to me, he didn't answer any question. I don't even know if I asked a question. So at this point, I was like, panicking, because, all my life I'd wanted to be a journalist, and I was a journalist at Time Magazine, and they gave me this assignment, and I was just, I had just completely failed. So I was trying to talk to Dole's press secretary afterwards, asking him if he would give me just 5 minutes with the senator, just so I could get my quote on the working poor. And so I'm talking to him, and he's totally like looking at me like, who is this guy? And he's completely blowing me off. And then Dole walks up, and he was the Senate Majority Leader. He was a presidential candidate, and very impressive man. And I'll never forget, he walks up and he says, and he stops his press secretary, who's totally blowing me off, and says, this is Sandeep Jauhar. He's an intern at Time magazine, and he wants a quote from me about America's working poor. See if you can set up a 5-minute phone chat. And this was like half hour earlier, like outside the bathroom, and I thought I had completely stuttered a bunch of gibberish, but somehow, you know, he was smart enough, astute enough, I mean, I guess because he was a very successful politician, that he took that information, put it in one part of his brain, and then like pulled it out half hour later after he had spoken to all his Senate colleagues. And in any case, I spoke to him the next day for about 15 minutes on the phone, and it was really cool, and I got my quote. And so at the end of that summer, I was about to go to medical school, and then, you know, I started having second thoughts, doubts, and that's like this recurrent theme. So when I heard this beautifully packaged story in the introduction, I thought, wow, you know, that's such a cool story, but it didn't really work out exactly like that. There were a lot of stuttering along the way. So at the end of that summer, I was leaving Time magazine, about to go to Washington University to start anatomy lab and, you know, cutting cadavers. And I thought, you know what, this is pretty cool what I'm doing, you know, like talking to people like Dole, and, you know, so I should just stay here. So I went to talk to the bureau chief at Time magazine, a guy named Dan Goodgame. And I said, you know, I really want to be a journalist. I think I'm going to bag medicine. And he said, no, you don't want to do that. And I said, well, okay, I'll go to medical school, but what if I want to write about medicine or write about stuff in the future? Can you give me some contacts? So he said, yeah, sure. You know, here's some people at, you know, various places. And I said, yeah, that's kind of cool. But what about the New York Times? And he's like, all right, fine. Okay, so I know this guy at the New York Times. So I said, okay, great. So I sort of wrote down his name, and Dan was gracious enough to say, if you ever call this fellow in the future, use my name. I said, okay, great. So I went to St. Louis, started anatomy lab, started learning about the cranial nerves, but then so one day I was just, I don't know, frustrated or, you know, with having to memorize all the cranial nerves or whatever, and I thought, you know, I'm just going to call up this guy. So I rang up this guy, his name was Gerald Boyd, and he was the national political editor, and he ended up becoming second in command of the entire New York Times. A very, very powerful guy. And I called him up, and, you know, again, there's this thing, the theme of serendipity. You know, you can count on serendipity in your life. It's you know, there are always going to be moments of luck. So this was one moment for me, because when I called him, he should have just blown me off, because I didn't know what I was talking about, and I wasn't even sure why I was calling him, because I was in medical school, but I thought maybe I'd want to write for the New York Times one day, so I should just call this guy up. But then it turns out that he was from St. Louis. And not only was he from St. Louis, he used to live on the same street I was living on, and Kings Highway. So he's like, oh, where do you live in St. Louis? I was like, Kings Highway. He's like, oh, Kings Highway, I lived on that street. So yeah, tell me about yourself, you know, and we started chatting. He's like, okay, well, you know, if you ever if you're ever in New York, give me a call. We'll have you know, coffee or something. And I said, oh, that's great. Thank you very much, Mr. Boyd. So I hung up the phone. I did what, you know, anyone here who'd want to be a journalist would do. I'd pick up the phone, dialed American Airlines, booked a flight to New York. And then I called his assistant back. I said, I'm coming to New York, and Mr. Boyd wants to meet with me. And she's like, really? She's like, who are you? I'm like, I'm a medical student from Washington University in St. Louis. She's like, okay, fine. So anyway, I ended up going to New York like the following week, and I went into his office, and it was at that point, right? So when you're trying to figure out what you want to do with your life, it's really important to be a little stupid, okay? You have to be stupid, because if you get limited by the constraints that you perceive, then you won't do stupid things, and you won't ask for things that you have no business asking for. And so I had no business being in that room, because when I looked up on the wall, he was like with the premier of China, and he was with he was with George Bush. There was one picture of him with George Bush, right? I'm like, oh my God, what am I doing here? And so he walks in, and he wasn't nearly as cool in person as he was on the phone. And so he's like, what do you want? And I was like, well, remember when we talked on the phone? Remember I live on Kings Highway like you? And he's like, yeah. What do you want? What are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm in medical school, but I want to write for the New York Times. And he's like, okay, show me your stuff. I was like, well, I don't really have any stuff, but I'm a pretty good writer. And he's like, oh my God, so he just thought I was a complete imbecile, and he should have just kicked me out of his office. But what he did, he sort of kicked me out of his office. Actually, he kicked himself out of the office because he left. And then 5 minutes later, a woman came in, and it turned out she was a doctor who was writing for the New York Times. And her name is Elizabeth Rosenthal. And I don't know if any of you read the New York Times, but she's written some really amazing stuff in the last couple of years she wrote this series called Paying Till It Hurts, which is an amazing series about medicine and how we pay for medical care in this country. So she comes in and she's like, yeah, so what's up? And I'm like, well, I'm here because I'm a medical student, and I was thinking about just doing journalism full time maybe, and she's like, no, don't do that. Go back to medical school. And you don't really do things this way. You can't really walk into the New York Times and ask for a job and ask to start writing. It doesn't work that way. What you need to do is go back to St. Louis and write for your local newspaper. And if you're really interested in writing, and see where that goes, and you can send me your stuff. So I went back to St. Louis, and long story short, I got an internship in my second year of medical school at the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. And I remember when they offered it to me, I thought, you know what? There's no way I'm going to be able to do this, because I'm in my second year of medical school, and there's no way that I'm going to have the time to do this. And I remember calling my brother, and he said something that I'll never forget. He said, there are a lot of hours in the day. And that was his way of saying, you know what, just try it. See what comes of it. So I did it. And I would skip afternoon classes because I had to be at the newspaper, and so I'd read the transcripts. But I'd go to all the morning sessions, and I'd go in the afternoon, and I'd get there, and they'd be like, we hear that a lot of people are getting stung by wasps in Forest Park. Write a story about wasps. And oh, by the way, it's due at 5 o'clock. And it used to be 1 o'clock. So I had to totally get my act together and call wasp experts, and this was something that really got me. It sort of gave me the experience that I needed, and so I wrote a bunch of pieces, sent them to the New York Times, and then when I graduated from medical school, I decided to go to New York to do my internship, and And then the last little bit of the serendipity is that there was a new editor at the New York Times who wanted someone to start writing about medicine, someone young. And she said, why don't you, I've seen some of your stuff from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, why don't you write about your internship? And it turns out that was a great thing because some of you are going to do internships. Some of you are going to do internships in medicine. You're all going to do internships probably in something, because no one can go into anything straight anymore. You have to do an internship. Internship in medicine is like, well, it's really hard, but it's also a great time. It's a very creative time, because the creative process relies on tension and conflict and novelty, and that's what internship was for me, because the stuff I saw during internship I'd never seen before. So I started writing about internship, and the articles I wrote eventually got me a book agent, and then the book agent encouraged me to, and I ended up getting a contract, and that's how Intern was born. So that's the second part of the story, how I got into writing. And then the last part is I'll talk a little bit about Intern, the book, and I'll read, I probably only have time for one selection from the book, and then I'll take some questions. So like I said, internship's a great time to start writing, and the reason why is no matter what you do your internship in, internship is like, it's like the newness, the novelty of the experience is so critical. And today, when I see things in the hospital, a lot of the time I sort of like shrug and say, well, that's how things are done. But when I was an intern and I would see things, they would bother me. And so I would write about the stuff in the New York Times that would bother me. So like one thing that bothered me, I remember from my internship year, was there was a guy, a patient in the hospital, an older gentleman who had a difficult time swallowing. He couldn't swallow. And when he would swallow into his lungs. He would aspirate, and then he would get pneumonia. So everyone on the team was getting ready to send him to a surgeon to put in a stomach tube, a feeding tube. But the thing is that he didn't want it. Like for him, the great pleasure in his life was food. He wanted to taste food. And he was willing to accept a shorter life, maybe a life ending miserably on a ventilator, having pneumonia from aspiration, as long as he could eat food. He just wanted to taste the food. And so, but somehow this message, because maybe he had a little bit of dementia, it wasn't clear if he totally had capacity to make that decision. His family was pushing for the feeding tube. But as an intern, I sort of looked at the situation, I thought, this is terrible. What are we doing here? The guy clearly just wants to be able to taste food, and he doesn't want a feeding tube. And I would tell people this, and they're like, what's the alternative? To let him eat and die of pneumonia? And I was like, yeah, I guess that's pretty bad. And so I remember one day, the day he was going to get the feeding tube, that morning I went to his room, and I brought some little cartons of juice and applesauce, and I said, you know what, I'm just going to do my own swallowing test. And I told him, listen, I'm going to give you some stuff to swallow. You better swallow it, okay? Don't aspirate it, okay? Or, it's my ass, basically, because I shouldn't be doing this. But I don't want you to get a feeding tube. And he's like, okay. And he swallowed it. Maybe he coughed a little bit, I don't know. But he swallowed it okay. And so I quickly went out, and I told everyone that I did my own swallowing test, and I documented in the chart, And I called the surgeon. I said, he doesn't want, we're not going to send him for the feeding tube. And the surgeon was kind of relieved, because I don't think he really wanted to do it in the first place. See, these are the things that today, as a doctor, honestly, if I saw, a guy with, dementia, who aspirates, about to get a feeding tube, I probably wouldn't question it. But as an intern, I questioned it. And that's why I think that time in one's life is just so critical for being creative and questioning things and learning. It's a very steep learning curve. So I'm going to read one selection from the book, and then I'll take some questions. Okay? So I was going to read two sections, but I'll just read this one. So this was, when I started my internship, I did a bunch of different rotations. I started off in the outpatient clinic, then I went to the intensive care unit, and then I went to the general medical wards. So this is a selection from the wards. So when you're on the wards, you sometimes take call, which means you're up all night. So this is about being up all night. Sometimes I worried about how I was going to get through another night on call, until I realized that my patients were helping me. Their bodies had homeostatic reserve, the capacity to self-correct, to compensate for my mistakes. In physics, an oscillator quickly returns to its equilibrium position after being displaced. And so it is, I came to believe, with the human body. Most of my patients were going to be fine despite anything I did. And if they were going to die, well, that was probably going to happen despite me too. Health was like the wilderness. It could only be spoiled by human intervention. We're not saving patients, my brother told me. We're just stabilizing them so they can save themselves. I became awed by this concept, but most of my colleagues seemed indifferent to it. We performed our interventions with such confidence, such arrogance, but most of the time there was no way of predicting whether we were doing the right thing or even a good thing. We'd give potassium for hypokalemia, or diuretics for edema, or nitroglycerin for high blood pressure, and we would overshoot. The diuretics would make our patients dehydrated, or the nitroglycerin would lower their blood pressure too much, and then we'd have to give them intravenous fluid or raise their blood pressure with other drugs, and the process would start all over again. Sometimes we would give drugs just to treat the side effects of other drugs. Sometimes we would do illogical things like giving fluid and diuretics at the same time, and no one questioned it, including me. There was too much going on, too much complexity to start asking questions. I wasn't sure where to begin. I wasn't even sure I knew enough to know what to ask. My energy was low, my enthusiasm flagging, and the system was in automatic drive anyway. The easiest thing to do was to get out of the way. When the nurses woke you in the middle of the night, you had to be prepared to deal with the unexpected. You knew that energy, clarity, fluent speech were coming. You just didn't know when. One night I was half asleep when I got paged. Must be blood culture time, I thought, reaching for the phone. In the dark, the receiver vibrated like an image from a jittery screen projector. When I called the number on my beeper, an urgent voice told me to go to Mrs. McDougall's room. When I got there, it was as if I had walked in on a play. Mrs. McDougall was standing precariously in the middle of her private room in a puddle of urine. Bright ceiling lights were beating down on her like stage spotlights. She was an attractive woman for 91, with a sharp patrician nose and handsome cheekbones like Lauren Bacall's. Her gown was open in the back, exposing her scoliotic torso, which was covered with age spots, like cow patties in a field. A nurse and 2 orderlies were circling her like muggers. They were trying to get her to go back to bed, but the old woman was insisting on going to the bathroom alone. "We'll help you go in the bedpan," someone said, grabbing her arm to keep her from falling. "I want to go to the bathroom," she shrieked, trying to wriggle free. "We can't let you walk there. I'm not going in the bed. You're going to slip and fall. Leave me be." I was trying to keep from falling over myself. I tried reasoning with Mrs. McDougall, but she wouldn't listen to me either. After a couple of minutes of urging, I asked the nurse why we couldn't just let her go to the bathroom. "She could break her hip," the nurse said indignantly. "She could, but I don't think she will," I replied. "I can go by myself," Mrs. McDougall cried. "I know," I said, "but let me walk you anyway." I offered her the crook of my arm, and, much to my amazement, this appeal to her ladylike instincts seemed to work. Off we went, with an aide on either side, to the toilet. An aide went in with her while the rest of us waited outside. "She's sundowning," the nurse said, clearly irritated, referring to a kind of nocturnal delirium often observed in nursing homes. "Before you leave," she told me, "order restraints." "Do you think that's necessary?" I asked, skeptically. "What if she sundowns again?" the nurse said. "Just call me," I replied. People in the hospital were always obsessing about disasters that never occurred. I had seen it myself in the CCU, where nurses would use as-needed sedative orders to keep patients groggy and cooperative through the night. When Mrs. McDougall came out, I walked her back to bed. "You're a nice young man," she said. "Thank you," I replied. "I like you," she said. "Well, I like you too," I said. That was the nicest thing I had heard all week. I was going to show these nurses that a little kindness could go a long way. The next page came about 45 minutes later. When I arrived back in the room, the scene was much the same as before, except now Mrs. McDougall was standing in a slurry of feces. She was yelling some of the vilest obscenities, cocksuckers, motherfuckers, that I had ever heard from a nonagenarian's lips. The stench was overpowering. I cupped my hand over my face, but the putrid odor still registered in my olfactory lobes. "Mrs. McDougall," I cried through my fingers, "what are you doing?" "Who the hell are you?" she screamed hoarsely. "Dr. Jauhar," I said, incredulous. "Don't you remember me? You promised you were going to stay in bed." "I need to go to the bathroom." I ordered her back to bed immediately. "You're not my doctor," she shouted. "Call Silverman. Tell him to get me out of here." I told her that Dr. Silverman wasn't available. "Get out of my way," she cried, swinging wildly at me. She slipped and fell into my arms, rubbing brown excrement onto my scrubs. Steadying myself, I felt my right sandal slide a bit. The nurses were looking at me with "I told you so" satisfaction. For a moment, I fantasized about putting Mrs. McDougall into a chokehold and dragging her by the neck to bed, elbowing the nurse and orderlies out of the way, hissing, screaming at them to end this godforsaken shitfest. But of course, that couldn't happen. I had to deal with the situation calmly. "Give her 5 of Haldol and 2 of Ativan," I shouted out as I tried to keep her from tipping over. "Yes, doctor," the nurse responded sarcastically before going out to get the medicine. The 2 aides and I managed to force her back to bed. When the nurse returned, she administered 2 intramuscular injections. Almost immediately, Mrs. McDougall stopped struggling. Within minutes, she was snoring heavily. I felt momentary relief until the reading from the oxygen meter started to drop. 99, 98, 97. Pretty soon, an oxygen mask was plastered to her face, and I was turning a knob counterclockwise on the wall. 94, 93, 92, The brief calm quickly turned into another round of panic. Why had I been so impulsive? Was there an antidote for Haldol? Should I call an ICU consult? Where were the nurses now? For the next couple of hours, I remained at her bedside. I stabbed her wrist with a needle to get an arterial blood gas, which revealed borderline oxygen and carbon dioxide levels. I prayed the drugs would wear off. Why had I allowed myself to be goaded so rashly? In an effort to protect her, or perhaps myself, I was afraid that I had killed her. It was an apt metaphor for my internship thus far. By the next morning, Mrs. McDougall had returned to her sweet, great-grandmotherly self. At lunchtime a few days later, nurses, social workers, and people with nondescript titles like coordinating manager met to discuss patient disposition, who was going to be able to go home, who was going to require long-term care, and so on. My resident told me to attend on his behalf. At the meeting, everyone seemed to be having a rollicking good time talking about the patients, exchanging gossip about family dynamics, and so on. The subject of Mrs. McDougall came up. Dr. Jauhar had a wrestling match with her a few nights ago, a social worker said, and everyone laughed except me. Someone asked where Mrs. McDougall was going to go once she left the hospital. Her daughter wanted to put her in a nursing home, but she wanted to go back to living independently. No way that's going to happen, someone said with a certitude I found troubling. Someone asked me for my opinion. I had had so little interaction with her, just one unfortunate incident, that I wasn't sure how to respond. I was wary of saying anything that could send her to a nursing home for the rest of her life. She had been delirious, no doubt, and a danger to herself, but she had also been in an unfamiliar environment with people she thought were trying to hurt her. Surely that had to enter the calculus for predicting future behavior. It was anyone's guess what she would be like in a more familiar environment. Wouldn't putting her into an institution just increase the likelihood of further sundowning? I thought of the Chekhov story, Ward Number 6, and the incarceration of Yefimich. I did not want to be responsible for institutionalizing another person. I had seen it before on the psychiatry wards. If someone said they were well enough to go home, we would say they lacked insight into their disease and keep them even longer. Where was Dr. Silverman? I wondered. We were discussing the future of a stranger over sandwiches and soft drinks, and that was beginning to seem normal. So I'm going to end there. It's 8 o'clock. Thank you for your attention.